Today we're going to go ahead and take a look at how to find the number of solutions for a parabola by using the discriminant. So we can take a look and do a little bit of math and know whether or not our parabola is going to cross the x-axis once, twice, or never. And then we're going to go ahead and take a look at imaginary numbers, which is how we can deal with when we have a negative underneath a square root sign. So let's go ahead and jump right in. So we have, for our notes today, number of solutions. And once again, that's the number of roots. That's the number of zeros. That's the number of x-intercepts. And imaginary numbers. Okay, so we're going to kind of take care of both of those today. So let's go ahead and jump right in with example number 1. So once again, we use this when we are looking at an equation for a parabola. So we have 3x squared plus 5x minus 10. And of course, that can be equal to y. That can be equal to f of x. That can be equal to 0. And we want to know how many times this is going to cross the x-axis by using the discriminant, which is a specific number. So in order to do this, our first step is to go ahead and pull out your A, your B, and your C. Okay, so our A in this case is 3. It's the number in front of the x squared. Our B is 5, number in front of the plane x, and our C is negative 10. Make sure you're including that sign. Okay, and our discriminant itself is a formula. And that formula is simply b squared minus 4ac. And that should be familiar to you because it is the part of the quadratic formula that's underneath the square root sign. So our second step is plug in and solve using the order of operations. So we're going to plug in B for B, A for A, and C for C. So for this specific problem, our discriminant is going to be 5 squared minus 4 times 3 times negative 10. And then we're going to simply solve. So let's take a look here. 5 squared is 25. Negative 4 times 3 is negative 12. Negative 12 times negative 10 is positive 120. 120 plus 25 is 145. So our discriminant is an actual number. In this case, it's the number 145. So we are going to go ahead and analyze this number. So if this number, so we're looking at our discriminant number, if this number is a positive number, then that means there's going to be 2 roots. So if I'm looking at my parabola that has 2 roots, it could be something like this, where it's crossing the x-axis in 2 different spots. Now, if the number ends up being 0, the number is 0, then that means that there is going to be 1 root. So that means that we have a parabola that has its vertex on the x-axis. And if we end up with a negative number, then that means that there are no roots. And that's because if you think of our discriminant as what's underneath the square root, it means that we get an error in our calculator. If there is a negative underneath the square root, then we cannot solve because it has no roots. So it's something that might look like this, right? It can cross the y-axis, but it's not going to ever cross that x-axis. So as we're doing the discriminant, It's very quick, very easy way to find out how many times it's going to cross the x-axis. And we simply plug in b squared minus 4ac, and you're going to be, in your work today, it's going to ask you what the specific number is of the discriminant. So be careful with your math on that, and then it's going to ask you how many roots there are. Okay, so our second half is the first time we're delving into imaginary numbers. And you're going to use this a lot more in Algebra 2. But basically, our imaginary numbers is very specific. It's simply allowing us to continue to do math when normally we would say, oh, we got an error, we can't do anything else. And it is simply that the square root of -1, which of course in our calculator gives us an error, we're going to be able to rewrite that square root of -1 as the letter I. Notice it's a lowercase I, and you'll see it with that little curve on it. So what this means, if I have the square root of -121, once again in my calculator it gives me an error. But what I'm going to rewrite that is as -1 times 121. And then we have the square root of 121, which we can take out because that's a perfect square. And so that is going to be 11 times the square root of -1. And then we know that that -1 can be written as I. So we can rewrite that as 11I. However, we know the square root of 121 can also be -11. So we can also write it as -11I. Okay, and that's how we get around the fact that we can still continue to do math, but now we're able to go ahead and get those two answers. Now, in our activity today, although we know there is a positive and a negative, we will only have you write the positive version of it. Okay, let's go ahead and take a look at another one. If I have the square root of -25, then I can rewrite that as the square root of -1 times 25, which we can rewrite as plus or minus 5 times the square root of -1, which we can rewrite as plus or minus this 5, and then that's where our I goes. Okay, and one last one. We won't do all the mid steps. The square root of -225. Of course, we just do 225 in our calculator. That's 15. And so we know that our answer is 15I or -15I. Okay, so that, ladies and gentlemen, is how we use imaginary numbers. I means it's an imaginary number, and it allows us to take the negative outside of our square root and continue to work on math. Okay, so ladies and gentlemen, these are your notes for the day. Let's go ahead and practice in our daily Desmos activity.